Welcome to Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai Lit Fest, in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. We kick off this year's festival with our online sessions, packed full of the power of words and ideas. Today's The Play is the Thing is a conversation that is both relevant and timely. This conversation was recorded before the recent atrocities in the region. The power of theatre to shape our thoughts and sensitize our hearts is immense. The book, Enter Ghost, follows actress Sonia as she returns to Palestine and takes a role in the West Bank production of Hamlet. Here with us today is the Sue Kaufman, Betty Trask, and Plimpton Prize Award winner, Miss Isabella Hammad. In conversation with her is writer, curator, art critic, columnist, and editor, Mr. Girish Shahane.
Hi everyone, I'm joined today by the Palestinian British novelist Isabella Hammad, who in the spring of this year published a very well-regarded novel, Enter Ghost, which we are going to be discussing over the next 45 minutes. Hello, Isabella.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Enter Ghost, as immediately tells us that it is a play about theatre in some ways, at least the theatre cue is something that people might pick up on. And indeed, it is about an actress who moves from London to Palestine and ends up acting in a production of Hamlet. So the central character, Sonia Nasir, being an actress, do you have a background in theatre? Is that what drew you to the idea of having an actress as your central character, or was it completely unrelated to your experience?
I've not been an actor, no. I've been in sort of school plays and plays, I have the experience of learning a script and being on a stage. So I had some idea of what that's like. But actually the idea of the novel came from a different source. I was interested in theatre in Palestine specifically, as a kind of artistic form of resistance, or as a kind of art form that that is about bodies in space and in a context that is in some ways quite, elements of the situation in Palestine are quite theatrical. They're kind of about the performance of bodies in space and the control of bodies in space. So there was something sort of interesting in those two things that sparked my imagination quite a long time ago. I also saw a film called Anna's Children when I was a teenager, which is about made by a man called Giuliano Merchamis, about his mother who set up a theatre school for children in Jenin refugee camp. And he subsequently turned that into the Freedom Theatre, which was a well-known theatre in Jenin. So there were sort of a few things that made it, kind of planted the seeds of the idea of talking about theatre in Palestine. That was the kind of the basis of it. And then I developed the character of Sonia from there.
Yes. She originally is from London, as I said, and she moves to her sister's place in Haifa. And it is in a way getting away from a relationship. But then she is gradually drawn back to her old contacts and her old memories. And the entire idea of the ghost is something, of course, that haunts this novel at many levels. And everybody has a kind of ghost of their own. And sometimes at one point, the ghost is Sonia herself in fashion. And would you like to discuss a bit of the layering of the idea of the ghost throughout this novel?
Yeah, I mean, the title came quite late. It wasn't called Enter Ghost until kind of a while after I'd finished it. It had a different title. But of course, I was conscious of ghosts throughout, largely because obviously I'm using the play Hamlet, and Hamlet, strongly features a ghost character. I chose Hamlet in part because I wanted it to be sort of accessible to people who'd never even read Hamlet or weren't familiar with Shakespeare. You sort of know some basic things, to be or not to be, and you probably know there's a ghost, right? So that was the sort of in that play, the ghost is what sends Hamlet on the mission. It's a kind of exhortation to action. So in a way, most of the ghosts in the novel, or the gestures at ghosts or ghostly presence, are again exhortations to action. They linger because something needs to be done. So that's a kind of the basis of some of my thinking around ghosts. In the Palestinian context, the strongest ghosts are in a way the ghosts of the previous generation who exhort the next generation to act, as Hamlet's father, exhorts Hamlet to act. But in a way, there's Palestinians haunt the Israelis. There's a sort of like kind of persistence, the persistent presence or a kind of return of the repressed that is there politically, while also obviously in the personal stories of the different characters as well. The persistence of the past.
Yes, you are referring to when you say the Palestinians haunt the Israelis, a very material kind of action in the novel that indicates that. Is Mr. Klein, who now owns a house that the Nasirs owned, Sonia's family owned. And at one point, twice really, but once she actually tries to meet the new owners and they're quite dismissive of her attempt. And it was interesting for me personally, and I think for Indians in this context, because in India, we had the partition, and the stories of going back to the houses that were lost are always of houses that were lost in the partition by people who had to move across the new border. But interestingly, in those, always, there's a great love and a welcome back when the person crosses the border again and finds their own house. So it's interesting how different it is in this context from an Indian perspective. Though obviously, the situation being what it is, it's natural that it would be very different. But
it's fascinating to hear that, actually. Yeah, I mean, the Sonia's family are from Haifa, so they survived 1948. They survived the Nakba. They're survivors of an ethnic cleansing. So that population of Palestinians who then became Israeli citizens of the new state. So they have this sort of double identity, or this complicated positionality, I suppose, being very privileged among the fractured Palestinian body politic, because they've got Israeli passports, but then, second or third class citizens within the Israeli state. So they occupy this interesting position. But they're kind of ghostly presences, right? They're sort of reminders for the Israeli state. They defy the messaging that Palestine was never there, or there's a kind of way in which it complicates the Israeli narrative of statehood. And yes, when Sonia goes to see the house, that's also riffing on a kind of, Palestinians and the children of refugees will often go back to, it's a sort of thing people do, is to go back and find the house of their grandparents, or to go and visit. And to then encounter the current inhabitants. This is a story, I mean, I've tried to do it, many people do it, but in this case, it's a sort of, the family actually sold it much later. So it's actually a kind of, I wanted to gesture to that trope, or that kind of common idea or common experience of returning to visit the house while also subverting it at the same time.
Yes. Since you mentioned you tried to do it, I mean, would you like to share with us what your personal experience of this was?
Well, when I went, so my aunts had gone, my grandfather was from Haifa. My aunts had gone and met an old man who showed them the house on the mountain on Carmel. When I went, the old man had passed away, but I met his children. But then I subsequently found, I now suspect that he may have taken them to I'm not sure, but may have taken them to a random house. Just to give them the feeling of return. So I'm not entirely convinced that was really the house. So there's some sort of blurriness around where the house actually was. So yeah, I didn't succeed, but I made obviously pilgrimages to Haifa. Yeah.
That is in a way so kind of, it brings to mind so many incidents in the book itself, because it's so carefully layered that on the one hand, it was interesting to me that you have a sort of moral absolute, which is that the Israeli occupation is morally wrong. It's a kind of a form of evil. And that is never really questioned. And yet, in the responses to it, there are hundreds of nuances and layers that come into the responses, depending on whether people have been expatriates, whether they're what you call the 48ers or whether they're from the refugee camps. It's fascinating to see how you have managed to get so many layers of those experiences into the novel.
Thank you. I am happy with that read of it. That's great to hear.
You have thanked a number of Palestinian actors and theatre people at the end of the novel. Was some of this, did it come out of conversations with them and their experiences of how they perceive theatre as an act of resistance or not an act of resistance?
Certainly. I mean, with my first novel, I did a lot of interviews and I did a huge amount of research. So I sort of, when I set out for this book, I began a little bit like that, in the sense, well, I've got to, really know my stuff in a very intense way. So I started interviewing people. I kind of discovered I didn't really need to do a huge amount of that actually this was a novel that was going to be largely imaginative. But I did speak to people who had experiences in the theatre scene in the 70s and 80s. That was particularly interesting to me. And I also spoke to actors in general, just about their feelings about things, their ideas, their experiences of acting and being on stage. So I mean, I feel a bit like all novelists do research of different kinds. If you're writing about things other than yourself, or you're not writing autofiction, I feel like it only seasons the work, or it only deepens the work to talk to people, to kind of to deepen your understanding of different kinds of experiences. But the Palestinian theatre scene has a quite interesting history and was very lively, or kind of sort of burst into a sort of kind of amazing activity in the 70s and 80s, when art making was very sort of close to the revolution, this very intense way, not only theatrical production but also visual arts as well. So that was very enriching to talk to those people and to learn about that.
And Hamlet being a play where you have people from the age of Hamlet and even younger, Ophelia to Polonius, and they're played by actors of different generations. So you were able to bring in, through their perspectives, the way different generations as well view the struggle, the Palestinian struggle, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's quite a kind of attractive to me about writing about a cast, right? With a certain kinds of dynamics, it's a very intense experience to be in the cast of a play. You have a very sort of condensed time frame of producing a project. There's a sort of intensity of pressure put on those relationships. People fall in love. People fall out of love. They get angry with each other. There's a sort of something very enticing dramatically as a novelist to look at that kind of framework. And then in this case, it allowed me to include Palestinians from across the spectrum of legal statuses and geographies as well, with the exclusion of Gaza, because it wasn't realistic to include somebody from Gaza. They wouldn't have been able to make it with ease into the West Bank or to another part of historic Palestine. But I gestured to that absence, of course, in the novel. But in that way, it allows me to look at these relationships in a microcosm between these different parts of the Palestinian people, and those tensions as well, and the variations. So in a way, the putting on of the play becomes a kind of cipher for other kinds of organizing among a people.
Yes, and among the differences are also religious differences, which are not really stressed, but Sonia Nasser comes from a Palestinian Christian background, and Mariam, the wonderful director of the play as well. And then she's an amazing character and somebody that Sonia comes to admire increasingly, and we come to admire increasingly as the novel proceeds. Although at the beginning, there are communication gaps. There are lots of communication gaps between them. Yeah. And then, of course, there are the Muslim actors as well. So there is that interesting dynamic at play. You didn't stress the religious aspect too much, obviously, but there is a journey, for example, to the Church of the Nativity, which is very interesting. And so it kind of hovers around this kind of that there aren't just Jews and Muslims, but there's a Christian Palestinian community as well.
Yeah, I mean, very vibrant politically and culturally present Palestinian Christian population. That population has shrunk a bit within Palestine. A lot of those Christians emigrated for different reasons, but yes, very much alive. And I see no evidence or reason to emphasize schism between different. There's just another kind of facet of the multifariousness of the Palestinian population, which is very, very varied and kind of multicolored in lots of different ways. But yeah, I mean, I think, there's a sort of crucial scene in the book where Sonia joins a demonstration in Jerusalem around Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they pray. And she doesn't know how to do a Muslim prayer, but it's a kind of at first I was a little worried about including that demonstration because I'm quite conscious that the situation is erroneously seen as a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, as you say, when in fact there were Jewish Palestinians living in Palestine before 1948. It was they were all religions living together. And it's really not, it's a settler colonial situation. It's about land. It's not about religion, although obviously religious identity figures into it, and about the kind of sensitivity about certain religious sites, of course. But so to have Sonia as a Christian participate in that demonstration was also a sort of gesture towards intra-Palestinian solidarity as well. And also to point to the fact that the fight over Al-Aqsa is not about religion. It's about sovereignty above all else.
When we think of Hamlet, in the history of writing about it, not just by literary critics, but also by novelists, also by the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, it is fatherhood that is always central. And of course, James Joyce's Ulysses hovers like a ghost over Hamlet interpretations for those who have read Joyce. And so it was interesting to me that you emphasize the motherhood aspect of Hamlet. And I think that is a kind of perspective that in my knowledge has not really been explored very much in novels, certainly.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that. Yes, I mean, Gertrude as the mother of Hamlet is the character that Sonia ends up playing. She's actually one of few mothers. There aren't very many mothers in Shakespeare. The mother is kind of underexplored as a figure. And Gertrude doesn't have very many lines even. She's a sort of object of Hamlet's projections. So we don't really know much about Gertrude. I mean, it means that she's very pliable for interpretation. You can play up whether Gertrude is complicit in the murder of old Hamlet, or whether if she knows even, or if she's totally unknowing. And she's obviously the object of Hamlet's kind of disgust. He has this sort of disgust towards her, this intensity of his reaction to her, even though the ghost tells him, taint not thy mind against thy mother ought. I think I'm quoting it correctly. And he does anyway. He taints his mind against his mother, even though the ghost intervenes to tell him not to. But they're not, yeah, I mean, my exploration of Hamlet is quite mother-centric. It's all about women, and it's all about the sort of spectre of motherhood. Sonia is not a mother, but she's playing the role of the mother. In many ways, I was also thinking about the role of women in the Palestinian struggle, kind of the iconography of women as mothers, as the mother of the fighter, and how that also echoes a kind of Mother Mary figure, mother of Jesus, mother of the martyr. So there is all of these different, and then Hamlet's a kind of a martyr, these different kind of echoes, these different kind of icons, and how these women interact with those figures, those paradigms. And also how they kind of mother each other, that also maybe motherhood is sort of transferable. Maybe that there are other ways in which one can be a mother without actually literally raising a child. So I was sort of, without making an argument about it, it was something that I was sort of exploring. It became one of the central themes of the book.
Yes, just as a sidelight, I mean, Joyce interprets back to Mary, in fact, from Hamlet, and from the idea of the ghostly relationship between son and father, because it's so insubstantial. It says that actually Christianity is actually founded on this insubstantial relationship between the father and the son. And the material relationship with Mary was just whatever. I think he calls it the sly Roman imagination or something like that. So, I mean, It's the Mary figure is also interesting in this context, I think, or connected to it.
There's a book by Jean Genet called Prisoner of Love, which was one of the things that I was reading as I was beginning to write the book, kind of one of the things in my patchwork of influences, and it's about some time that he spent with the Palestinians in Jordan during the 70s, with the Palestinians and with the Black Panthers in Detroit. He kind of moves between the two. But there's a long passage about, I think the guy's name is Hamza, about one of the Fidaiyin and his mother. And I think he also uses the Mother Mary Christ dyad as well. And I think that was sort of where it entered my mind, was actually through that text, and then expanded when I chose Hamlet.
Right. I want to discuss briefly a slight jump at the idea of catharsis, because that's something that appears early in the novel, and it is a kind of meta-narrative happening, because in a way it's a comment on your own ending, if I may say so, because the ending is cathartic in a particular way, and there's a discussion of happy endings and tragic endings, and how the Arabians translated Aristotle, which is fascinating. Could you talk a little about Aristotle and catharsis and the Arab translators and your connection with that?
Sure. I mean, I was thinking about, of course, the sort of the unnamed presence here is Brecht, and his ideas of catharsis and of alienation, specific meaning of alienation, which is to deny the audience catharsis, or the sort of absorbing theatrical experience, but instead to make them aware of their economic and political and social conditions in which they're living, and thereby make them leave the theatre and do something about it, with the idea that catharsis sort of, relieves the audience of those uncomfortable feelings. That actually, when at the end of the play, you feel that although there's sort of dispute about what catharsis actually is, but some kind of purging of emotion, that you feel pity and fear, or some kind of intensity that when you leave, you feel relieved of, that actually this is a depoliticizing force and actually stops people from acting, which is quite an interesting idea in itself. It made me think about ancient Greece and what the role of theatre is in ancient Greece, whether it was to sort of siphon off these subversive energies in the population, so they kind of get them out of the way, and then they'll be relatively docile and subject to political organization. I don't know, but there's something in that, the kind of ritual effect of purging an audience of intense emotion. They discuss catharsis. I mean, kind of with a light touch. I didn't want to be too heavy-handed about it, but that's partly why, without giving too much away, the play, they don't finish the play in the performance at the end. It's incomplete, so you don't get catharsis. But there's this question about what the relationship is between art making and action.
Yes. And there's a quote, I don't know if you want to, are you prepared to read some sections? Would you like to? I have a couple of quotes, but if there's something connected to what we have been talking about, I'd love to have you read a section of that.
Sure, I'll just get the book up.
Yeah, sure. And meanwhile, while you do, I'm sorry, I should have thrown this at you earlier, but I might just quote something related to this while you find that book.
Please. I've got the book up. You can tell me where you want me to read from when you're ready.
Right. No, I mean, you know the book perfectly well, I think. So, if there's a section, I mean, I had one section I thought I had a horrible, useless revelation about the meaning of Hamlet. I'll just read. It's not a very large section. I had a horrible, useless revelation, which was that in some way, the meaning of our Hamlet depended on this suffering. The context gave our Hamlet its force. I knew Mariam had already had this revelation. Our play needed the protests, but the protests did not need our play. My face was burning. I wanted to rip it off. And so, again, the connection between the sort of protests that are happening all around this and the context of the play, and the feeling somehow of, should I say, inadequacy to be able to represent that. Is that something that you think so?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mariam has quite a utopian idea, about the role of theatre as an art. I mean, as an art form, it is, it's related to crowds. You have an audience. It's about the populace, the polis, the sort of, there's this way in which it does have a closer relationship to political action in this kind of way, or a sort of potential, right? You can rouse a crowd in a certain way. Whereas reading or other kinds of art forms might be experienced differently. They're in solitude or in different kinds of environments with different kinds of tones or atmospheres. But theatre, and there is also there was a history of, there has been, and still in some ways, of Israeli sensitivity to Palestinian theatre, in part because of this thing where it can rouse a crowd, or it can be spontaneous, or people can go off script. There's sort of a subversive potential in the theatre, right? Yeah. So Maryam herself, I mean, she's quite idealistic, I suppose, about her putting on her play. So she wants to have this rouse the crowd, as they did in the 80s. But at the same time, she wants it to be great art. So that's why she chooses this, the kind of like Hamlet, sort of the play of sort of high artistic seriousness, which is a move made by lots of people throughout history in different parts of the world. There's a particular history of that in Egypt, for example. But because she wants to get a crowd in, she selects a pop to be her main character, even though he doesn't have any experience of acting, because she wants to get a lot of people to come and see it. So there's a kind of, I suppose, Maryam is thinking quite directly about the relationship between art making and revolution. So she's thinking quite how they relate in a quite direct sort of channel, and that produces anxiety of these different kinds. And so I suppose I have Sonia in her process of becoming more politicized. She's thinking through these things as well, and that's part of the thinking here about representation and what it does.
Yes, and in a way, if you place, pardon me, I have a bit of a cold. If you place art within a particular context where the very making of the art is controversial, then the specific content almost becomes, in a way, a sideshow. I mean, I'm thinking of a performance, Kashmir being a contested kind of territory within India, and the India-Pakistan kind of is the unresolved colonial history, sort of an equivalent in some fashion to Israel and Palestine and to Ireland. And so there was a performance artist, Nikhil Chopra, who does his performances on the street, and he also draws landscapes. And the landscape is he just draws what he's looking at. And he did this performance in the Central Square and drew a clock tower. But just the fact that he was there in costume drawing something made the security forces nervous. And then when they grew antagonistic, the local crowd began to cheer him. So in a way, it becomes that kind of pebble dropped in the pond. And so there's a part of art that can do that. But then, as you say, there is also the content itself that Maryam is interested in. And how those two kind of connect is an interesting question.
Yeah, and also kind of uncontrollable and sort of unpredictable as well. You don't actually know what the response will be to such a thing. But when something is performative like that example you've just given, or potentially like a play, there's something in the moment, in the kind of spontaneity, the unrehearsed or the unrehearsable, that can intervene in the sort of the smoothness of our normal, or sorry, our social existences, where we don't pay attention to things. It can wake you up in a certain way. But it really depends. There's no formula for it. It's unpredictable. I think that's quite exciting and interesting.
As happens in the final performance, I don't know how much, again, it's in a novel like this, one doesn't want to give away too much because one hopes that readers will read it. But the final performance is something completely not what we would have expected at the start of the rehearsals. And it carries some of that charge of things that are unexpected.
Yeah. I don't want to do a plot spoiler, but yes, agreed. Yeah.
Right. It's easy in a way to talk. It's easier to talk about the political context, but that is just one thread really of this multi-threaded novel. And the relationship between Sonia and her sister Hani is also, an extremely important part of it. Could you speak a little bit about their history, their miscommunications, and their final semi-reconciliation?
Definitely. Thank you for asking about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that siblings in general, I don't have a sister, I have a brother, but I do think that the relationships between siblings are very interesting to observe as well as to experience, and the way that children respond to their siblings and what their siblings do and how they react, you know. And so I kind of painted these sisters as responding to the same events very, very differently and almost in reaction to one another. But there's a lot of love there as well. And there's also a way, because the family has been fractured in its own way, their parents are separated. I kind of place or I gesture at the role that Palestine actually plays in the fracturing of the family itself, where the mother is the child of a refugee, but the father, was born and raised in Haifa, and was very politically involved. And then the two daughters take different, not different positions, but they deal with their Palestinian heritage in different ways. And so where Haneen becomes quite politically committed in her own fashion and goes to live in Haifa, Sonia decides that she doesn't want anything to do with it at a certain point and stops going back. But at the same time, Haneen is a kind of almost maternal towards Sonia. She's the older sister. So at the beginning of the novel, we have Sonia arriving at Haneen's house, really wanting to be looked after by her older sister, and making these kind of demands of her, emotional demands of her that then she doesn't supply. So there's a sort of that kind of produces this dynamic of resentment, where a lot of those family dynamics they're very difficult to express, to actually articulate. There's so much that goes under the surface within families. The sort of force field of family dynamics is very, very powerful, very, very psychological, very related to our child selves, and then there's a point in the novel where it breaks the surface and they finally speak clearly to one another, which is sort of towards the end.
Yes, and one of the cathartic moments, though, as you say, because although in the end it ends with this uncertainty of the tear gas, the first performance itself is a kind of triumph, and there is a sense, for me at least, of great release and at the end of the novel, and the kind of pent-up energy of so much miscommunication and so many things at cross purposes does find a very, I would say, a happy release towards the end. At least that was my kind of reaction to it.
I'm happy to hear that.
I want to just go back to a personal story. We visited Israel and Palestine back in kind of golden period, I think, between the 1994 Oslo Accord and the 2000 failed Accord. And I remember taking a bus which was driven by a Palestinian around the Palestinian territories. And every time he saw a flag of Palestine flying, he would point and honk his horn, and once he ran over a curb, in fact, because there was a state building with a Palestinian flag. And there were so many other expressions at that time of hope. And all of us felt that this was just kind of around the corner now, some sort of resolution. And now it's 25 years later, and it seems more hopeless than ever. It's a very kind of, as a Palestinian yourself, is there a kind of despair? Despair is also something that you talk about a bit in the novel.
I mean, certainly the Oslo Accords of the 90s that you're referring to, which feature in the book, actually, in a way, and the promise of statehood, which, when you look at the small print, was never really going to be given. It was already, it was meant to be given in stages. The West Bank was mapped out into these territories, A, B, and C, with different levels of Palestinian sovereignty, with the idea of a kind of, I think it was like a 5-year plan that they would gradually all go under Palestinian sovereignty. But it never happened. And in fact, they're all really, in a way, under Israeli jurisdiction. So it was the sort of the lie of recognition of sovereignty without actual statehood, or really the intention of ever giving a state, because they would never give up the border, apart from anything else. So it certainly, certainly despair, certainly the title piece process, when really, because of that name, that's the idea that there was some progression or some process has for a long time been a cover for further land grabs, further de facto annexation of the West Bank. And so it's really was Said wrote about it very well in the morning after to be like, this is a huge mistake. And it has proven that way. I think there are other places to look for. I feel like hope is maybe not the word, but a certain kind of energy, a certain kind of forward thinking. Of course, you have to keep going. You do have to have some feeling of optimism to go forward. There are other places to look for it. There are other chinks. There are other things that make me feel, I guess, some kind of hope about the future for sure. But they're not with the roadmap laid out by the Oslo Accords, certainly.
Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit? Because, I mean, globally, the situation seems more depressive politically than it has been for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the point, isn't it? Is that even though the left more and more the word is out sort of about Palestine, it seems more and more obvious to more and more people what's happening. It's harder to cover it up. I think it's proving harder to cover it up. At the same time, there's sort of push rightward everywhere. So I feel like one needs to fight for progressive values, locally, domestically, for your own, in your own situation, and then to insist that the Palestinian cause is a part of that. That it is to insist that it's part of a progressive agenda. But I think that, yes, those two things are in tension. So I feel less optimistic, perhaps. Yeah.
You've had about 4 months after your novel has been released. You by now have got quite a few reactions, I think, from readers. Is there something that you expected that was not fulfilled, or more, that have there been unexpected reactions, ways of interpreting it that you did not at all foresee?
No, I feel really pleased with how people have responded to it. It's been a real pleasure to talk to readers about it. I was very touched when someone in the West Bank said, "Thank you for taking me to Haifa," which was very nice, and I didn't really think about that. That was something to hear. But no, it's been really great, actually.
That's good. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you. And again, for viewers, we did not, in a way, go into many of the details, because in a novel, one does not want to give away too much of the action or the story. And so when you read the novel, as I hope you will find a number of things that we just touched on very superficially. But I do urge you to read this very complex novel, which is a play, a novel with a play within it, and a lot of nested and interesting narratives in it. And thanks a lot, Isabella Hammad, for giving us this time. And now I turn you back to the organizers. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
A big, big thank you to Ms. Hammad and Mr. Shahane for their valuable thoughts, perspective, and of course, their time. That was a thought-provoking and moving conversation, leaving us with a lot to chew on. Next up at 9 p.m. is Dividing Line, War in the Imagination. We also look forward to seeing you all in person for the festival, happening across 2 of our venues, both the NCPA and St. Paul's. A heartfelt thanks to our wonderful sponsors, title sponsor Tata, in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Safari, powered by Godrej and Kotak. Here's to the power of words.